The day my parents asked if they could move into my house, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because 12 years earlier, those same two people had stood at their front door and told me I was no longer welcome inside. I was 34 years old when my father, Richard Carter, placed his coffee cup on my kitchen table and said, "Emily, we're getting older. We think it's time we lived with family again." My mother, Linda, nodded beside him. "We thought your home would be the best place for us," she added. My home. That word stayed in my mind. Because they weren't asking to move into a stranger's house. They were asking to move into the home I spent years building after they told me I would never survive without them. I looked around my kitchen that morning, the wooden cabinets I had chosen myself, the photographs hanging on the wall, the small garden outside the window that I planted every spring. Everything around me represented a life I created without their help, and they were sitting there, expecting access to it. What they didn't know was that I remembered every word from the night they pushed me out. I remembered the 2 suitcases beside my feet. I remembered the cold air outside their house. I remembered my father saying, "Maybe being on your own will finally teach you responsibility." At 18 years old, I stood there believing I had lost my family forever. But they were wrong about one thing. They thought I would come back. They thought I would fail. They thought I would eventually knock on their door and apologize. They never imagined that I would build a life they knew nothing about. Before I tell you how everything happened, I want to say something. If you have ever felt like the person your family overlooked, the person who was expected to give everything but receive very little, then this story may feel familiar. And if you believe that family should be built on respect, not guilt, I hope you stay until the end. Because the hardest part of my story was not leaving home. The hardest part was realizing why they wanted me back. To understand why that conversation in my kitchen affected me so deeply, I have to take you back to where everything started. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio. From the outside, my family looked like everyone else. We had a comfortable house, weekend dinners, holiday traditions, and family photographs that made us look happy. My parents, Richard and Linda Carter, worked hard to maintain that image. My mother cared a lot about what people thought of us. She wanted neighbors to believe we were successful, organized, and close. My father believed discipline was the foundation of raising children. He was not the kind of person who yelled all the time, but he believed his decisions were always right. There were 3 people in my immediate family: my parents, my younger brother Jason, and me. And from the time I was young, I slowly learned that Jason and I did not have the same role in the family. Jason was the child everyone protected. He was the child everyone believed would become something great. If he made a mistake, people found a reason to excuse it. If I made a mistake, people used it as proof that I needed to do better. I was the responsible one, the mature one, the one who could handle things. At first I thought being responsible was a compliment. I thought my parents trusted me. But as I grew older, I realized something painful. Sometimes families call you strong because they have already decided they do not need to take care of you. I became the daughter who helped without being asked, the daughter who noticed when my mother was stressed, the daughter who stayed quiet during arguments because I knew keeping peace mattered more than expressing how I felt. Jason was allowed to dream. I was expected to be practical. Jason was given second chances. I was expected to never make mistakes. And for years, I accepted that role because I wanted one thing more than anything else. I wanted my parents to be proud of me. I did not know then that trying to earn their approval would eventually lead me to the night they told me to leave. And that night would change everything. After I look back now, I realize the night my parents forced me out was not caused by one argument. It was the result of years of small moments where I learned that my place in the family could disappear whenever I stopped being useful. Growing up, I watched how differently Jason and I were treated. When Jason struggled in school, my parents immediately looked for solutions. They hired tutors, changed his schedule, and told everyone he was simply finding his path. When I struggled, I was told I needed to become more disciplined. I remember one afternoon when I was 17. I had just received a scholarship opportunity from a local college. I was excited because it meant I could continue my education without creating a financial burden for my parents. I showed the letter to my mother while she was preparing dinner. Instead of celebrating, she placed it on the counter and said, "Emily, are you sure this is realistic?" I remember looking at her and asking, "What do you mean?" She sighed and said, "Sometimes you get too focused on your own plans. You need to think about the family too." At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. Later, I realized she meant I was supposed to adjust my dreams around everyone else's needs. That became the pattern. Whenever Jason needed something, the family adjusted. Whenever I needed something, I was told to understand. I worked part-time jobs during high school and saved money for my future. But there were times when my parents borrowed money from me and promised they would return it. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. And when I mentioned it, my father would say, "Emily, we're family. You shouldn't keep score." But somehow, family only seemed to matter when they needed something from me. At family gatherings, I became the person who helped behind the scenes. I would set the table, clean the kitchen, organize things, and make sure everyone else was comfortable. Meanwhile, Jason would sit with relatives and talk about his plans. People would tell him, "You're going to do amazing things." I would hear comments like, "Emily is such a responsible girl. She can handle anything." I used to smile when they said that. But inside, I wondered why being able to handle everything meant nobody ever asked if I was tired. The hardest part was that my parents were not cruel every moment. That would have been easier. They had good days. They bought me birthday gifts. They attended some important events. They told me they loved me. But love without understanding can still leave scars. I constantly felt like I had to earn my place. I had to be useful. I had to be successful. I had to avoid disappointing them. The final argument happened when I made a decision about my own future. I wanted to study business and eventually create something of my own. My father disagreed. He wanted me to choose a safer career path and focus on helping Jason because he believed Jason needed more support. When I told him I could not keep putting my own goals aside, his expression changed. He looked at me like I had betrayed him. He said, "After everything this family has done for you, this is how you repay us?" Those words stayed with me, because I had spent years trying to prove I appreciated them. And somehow, the moment I chose myself, I became the selfish one. That night, I learned something I wish I had understood earlier. Sometimes people do not get angry because you hurt them. Sometimes they get angry because you stop allowing them to control you. But leaving that house was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of the life they never expected me to build. When I walked away at 18, I had 2 suitcases, a small amount of savings, and no idea how difficult the next few years would be. But I also had something I had never had before. A reason to stop waiting for permission. The first few months were harder than I ever admitted to anyone. I rented a tiny apartment with old carpet, noisy neighbors, and a kitchen barely large enough for one person. There were nights when I sat on the floor eating cheap meals because I was trying to make every dollar last. There were moments when I wanted to call my parents. I wanted to hear my mother say, "Come home." I wanted my father to admit he had gone too far. But every time I imagined making that call, I remembered the way they closed that door. So instead, I kept moving forward. I worked multiple jobs. I studied whenever I had time. I learned things nobody in my family knew I was capable of learning. Over the years, I became interested in home design and renovation. I loved taking old, forgotten spaces and turning them into something beautiful. It started as a hobby. Then it became a skill. Then it became a business. What my parents never knew was that while they believed I was struggling, I was quietly building a future. I created Carter Design and Renovations from the ground up. At first, it was just me helping a few homeowners with small projects. I answered emails at midnight. I carried supplies myself. I learned about contracts, budgeting, marketing, and customer relationships. Slowly, people started recommending me. One project became 5, 5 became 20. Eventually, I had employees working with me. I had clients who trusted my judgment. I had built something real. But I never announced it to my family. I never posted pictures trying to make them jealous. I never sent them updates hoping they would finally say they were proud. Because I had learned something important. A person who only celebrates you after you become successful does not always love your journey. Sometimes they only love the result. The house my parents wanted to move into was not just a building, it was proof of every difficult day I survived, every sacrifice, every moment I chose not to give up. And they had no idea. They had no idea what their daughter had become. But there was one person who did. And she was the reason I learned that family is not always the people who share your last name. Sometimes family is the person who believes in you when everyone else has already decided who you are. The person who believed in me before I believed in myself was Susan Miller. I met Susan during my second year of college. She was my business professor, but she became much more than someone who taught me about numbers, planning, and entrepreneurship. She was the first person who looked at my situation and did not see a broken teenager. She saw potential. I remember staying after class one evening because I was struggling with an assignment about building a business plan. Most students had already left, but I was sitting alone with my notebook open, trying to figure out how to create something from nothing. Susan walked by my desk and asked, "Emily, are you waiting for something?" I smiled and said, "I'm trying to figure out how someone like me is supposed to compete with people who already have support." She sat down across from me. Instead of giving me a motivational speech, she asked a simple question. "What makes you think you need permission to build something?" Nobody had ever asked me that before. Most people asked why I was trying to do something difficult. Susan asked why I thought I couldn't. Over time, she became someone I trusted. She knew about my parents. She knew I had left home. She knew there were nights when I was terrified I had made the wrong decision. But she never treated me like a victim. She always reminded me that my past explained where I came from, but it did not decide where I would end up. When my renovation business started growing, Susan was one of the first people I called. She helped me understand contracts. She encouraged me to separate emotions from business decisions. She told me something that stayed with me. "Emily, success attracts people who suddenly remember your name. Make sure you know the difference between support and convenience." At the time, I did not think those words would matter. Years later, I understood exactly what she meant. Susan was also the person who encouraged me to protect what I built. She helped me organize my company documents, property records, and financial information properly. She always believed preparation was not about expecting the worst from people. It was about respecting yourself enough to be ready. Even after I became successful, there was still a small part of me that wanted my parents to notice. I wanted them to see the woman I became. I wanted my father to say, "I was wrong." I wanted my mother to say, "I should have supported you." Susan understood that feeling. One afternoon, while we were having coffee, I admitted something I had never said out loud. "I think part of me is still waiting for them to choose me." Susan looked at me and said, "Emily, you spent years trying to earn a place in a family that should have given you one freely." That sentence hurt. Because it was true. But healing does not always come from hearing the apology you deserve. Sometimes healing comes from accepting that your future cannot depend on someone else finally understanding your pain. For years, I kept a respectful distance from my parents. We were not completely disconnected, but we were not close either. A few holiday messages, a few short conversations. Nothing deeper. I had learned how to protect my peace. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, while I was sitting in my office reviewing a client proposal, my phone rang. It was my mother. I stared at the screen for several seconds. I almost let it go to voicemail. But something inside me wondered if maybe things had changed. Maybe after all these years, they finally wanted to talk about what happened. Maybe they finally understood. I answered, "Hi, Mom." There was a pause. Then she said something I never expected. "Emily, your father and I have been thinking a lot lately. We think it's time our family became close again." My first instinct was hope, a small, fragile hope. But then she continued, "We would really like to meet with you. There are some things we need to discuss." Something about her voice felt different. Not warmer, not emotional. Careful, like someone choosing the right words. I asked, "Is everything okay?" She quickly said, Yes, everything is fine. We just think it's time we reconnect." After we ended the call, I sat there staring at my phone. For years, I had wondered what it would feel like if my parents finally reached out. I imagined an apology, I imagined them admitting they hurt me. I imagined hearing the words I had waited for since I was 18. But when the moment finally came, something felt wrong. I called Susan that evening and told her about the conversation. She listened quietly. Then she asked, "Emily, what did they actually say?" I repeated the conversation. Susan paused. "Did they ask how you were?" I thought about it. No. Did they apologize? No. Did they mention what happened when you left home? Again, I said no. Susan took a breath. "Then be careful. Sometimes people come back because they miss you, and sometimes they come back because they need something." I wanted to believe she was wrong. I wanted to believe my parents had changed, so I agreed to meet them. A few days later, I sat across from Richard and Linda Carter in a quiet restaurant near downtown. For the first few minutes, everything felt almost normal. My mother asked about my business. My father asked about my house. They smiled. They talked about old memories. And for a moment, I wondered if maybe this was the beginning of something different. Maybe people really could change. Maybe my family was finally ready to see me. Then my father placed his coffee cup down and looked at me. "Emily, we need to talk about something important." And the next sentence made me realize why they had really come back into my life. My father looked at me across that restaurant table, and for a moment, I felt like I was 18 years old again. Not because I was afraid, because I recognized the feeling. That feeling of waiting for someone else to decide whether I mattered. He took a sip of his coffee and said, "Emily, your mother and I have been thinking about our future." I nodded. "Okay." My mother reached across the table and touched his arm. "We're not getting any younger," she said softly. "And things have become more difficult than we expected." I listened carefully. I asked, "What kind of difficulties?" My father looked uncomfortable. "Our retirement situation isn't what we hoped it would be." My mother quickly added, "And Jason is dealing with his own problems right now." That sentence immediately stood out to me. Jason. Even now, after all these years, his problems were still the center of every conversation. My father continued, "We've been thinking about what makes the most sense for the family." I already knew where this was going, but I wanted to hear him say it. Then my mother smiled and said the words that changed the entire conversation. "We were hoping you would let us stay with you for a while." For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. I looked at both of them. "You mean, visit?" My mother shook her head. "No, Emily. We mean live with you." The restaurant suddenly felt quieter. I could hear the sounds around us, the clinking of plates, the voices from nearby tables, the sound of someone laughing across the room. But at our table, everything felt frozen. I looked at the two people sitting in front of me. The same people who once told me I needed to learn how to survive alone were now asking to move into the life I built alone. I asked the question that had been sitting in my heart for 12 years. "Did either of you ever think about what happened after you made me leave?" My mother looked down. My father sighed. "Emily, we have already talked about this." "No," I said quietly. "We haven't." He looked surprised. I continued. "You told an 18-year-old girl to leave your house. You knew I had nowhere permanent to go. You knew I was scared. Did you ever wonder what happened to me?" My father leaned back. "We thought you needed independence." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because after 12 years, he still believed the same thing. "You thought throwing me out was a lesson." He nodded slightly. "It made you stronger." I looked at him. "No, I became stronger because I had no other choice." My mother became emotional. "Emily, why are you making this about the past? We are trying to move forward." That sentence told me everything. They wanted a future with me, but they did not want to take responsibility for how they treated me. They wanted the finished version of me, the successful version, the woman with the house, the woman with stability, but they did not want to acknowledge the girl who had to struggle to become her. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply told them I needed time to think. My father looked disappointed. "I thought family would mean more to you." Those words were familiar. They had been used against me my entire life. Family. A word that somehow always appeared when they needed something. I left the restaurant that evening feeling strangely calm. Not happy, not angry, just clear. For years, I thought the hardest moment of my life was the night I left their house. I was wrong. The hardest moment was realizing they still saw me the same way. A person who would eventually come back. A person who would forgive without being heard. A person who would sacrifice herself because she was family. But I was not that 18-year-old girl anymore. And what happened next showed me they had underestimated me all over again. 2 days later, I received a message from my brother Jason. At first, I thought he was checking in. I was wrong. The message was short. Mom and Dad told everyone the move is happening soon. They're really excited about finally living with you. I stared at my phone. The move is happening soon. Not if Emily agrees. Not if Emily feels comfortable. Not if Emily wants it. They had already decided. My parents had spent years believing my choices belonged to them, and now they were trying to make one more decision about my life without asking me. I knew then that this was no longer just about a house. It was about a pattern, and this time, I was finally ready to break it. The anniversary dinner for my grandmother was supposed to be a simple family gathering. At least, that was what I thought. The restaurant was decorated with white tablecloths, small candles, and framed photographs celebrating my grandparents' 50 years together. I arrived wearing a simple blue dress, carrying a small gift for my grandmother. For once, I wanted a peaceful evening. I wanted to sit with relatives, enjoy dinner, and avoid old family conflicts. But the moment I walked into the room, I realized something was wrong. My aunt hugged me. "Emily, congratulations," I smiled politely. "For what?" She looked confused. "Your parents told us everything. We're so happy you're letting them move in with you." I froze. For a second, I thought she was joking. Then I looked across the room. My parents were smiling. They were greeting relatives like they had already won. My mother walked toward me. "There she is," she said warmly. "Our daughter finally understands how important family is." People around us smiled. They had no idea what was happening. They only knew the story my parents had told them. And in their version, they were loving parents who had finally been welcomed back. I looked at my mother. "Mom, I never said that." Her smile disappeared for half a second. Then she laughed softly. "Emily, don't make this awkward." That was the moment I understood. They were not asking anymore. They were announcing, and everyone was watching. I stood there in the middle of that restaurant, surrounded by relatives who thought they were witnessing a beautiful family reunion. But they were not seeing the truth. They were seeing a story my parents had created. My mother walked closer and lowered her voice. "Emily, please don't embarrass us." That sentence almost made me smile, because somehow, in my family, the person telling the truth was always the one accused of creating a problem. I looked at her and said calmly, "I'm not embarrassing anyone. I'm correcting something that was never true." A few people nearby stopped talking. My father heard me and walked over. "Emily, this is not the place." I looked around the room. He was right. It was not the place. But only because they had already used the place to announce a decision that was never theirs to make. "I agree," I said. "This conversation should not have happened here." My father's expression hardened. "You're really going to do this in front of everyone?" I looked at him. "Dad, you already did this in front of everyone. I'm just refusing to pretend." The room became uncomfortable. My brother Jason looked away. For years, Jason had been protected from consequences. He was used to situations changing when things became uncomfortable, but this time, nobody could change what had already been said. My mother crossed her arms. "We cannot believe you are acting this way after everything we sacrificed for you." There it was. The same sentence, the same guilt, the same expectation. I took a breath. "I appreciate everything you did for me as my parents, but being your daughter does not mean I owe you my home." My father shook his head. "You have become very cold." That hurt. Even after everything, hearing him say that still hurt. But it did not break me anymore. I answered quietly, "No." I became someone who finally learned that saying no does not make me a bad daughter. Nobody spoke. My grandmother looked down at her plate. My aunt looked uncomfortable. Even people who had accepted my parents' version of events seemed unsure. Because the truth was no longer hidden. My parents had expected me to stay silent. They had mistaken my silence for agreement. And that was their mistake. I left the dinner early. On the drive home, I kept replaying the evening in my mind. Not because I regretted what I said, because I realized something important. For years, I had been afraid of disappointing them. But they had never been afraid of disappointing me. That night, I finally understood the difference. When I arrived home, I sat in my living room for a long time. The same room I had worked years to create. The same room my parents now viewed as their solution. I looked around and thought about the 18-year-old version of myself standing outside their house with 2 bags. She had no idea where she would sleep. She had no idea how she would pay her bills. She had no idea if she would ever feel secure again. But she survived. And now, 12 years later, people who once believed I would fail were asking me for the safety I created. The next morning, I called Susan. I told her everything. She listened quietly. Then she asked, "Emily, what do you want to do?" That question was simple. But nobody had asked me that in years. What do you want? Not what does the family need. Not what will keep everyone happy. Not what will avoid conflict. What do you want? I realized I already knew the answer. I did not want revenge. I did not want to punish them. I wanted peace. But peace required boundaries. Susan reminded me to look at everything practically. "Emily, this is your home. Make sure you protect yourself." So I did. I reviewed every document connected to my house. The mortgage paperwork, the ownership records, the insurance documents. Everything confirmed what I already knew. The house belonged to me. Not my parents, not my family, mine. Then I checked my phone. And that was when I found something that made my stomach drop. A family group chat I rarely checked had dozens of new messages. My parents had been discussing their move for weeks. They had talked about which room they wanted. They had talked about selling their furniture. They had even told relatives they were excited to finally be close to Emily again. But nowhere in those messages did I find one thing: a message asking me. They had planned my life without me. Again, I saved screenshots of the conversations. Not because I wanted to expose them, not because I wanted to hurt them, because I needed to remind myself that I was not imagining what happened. For years, I had questioned my own feelings. I had wondered if I was too sensitive, if maybe I was the problem. But those messages showed me the truth. They still believed my boundaries were just obstacles they needed to overcome. I knew then that I could not have another emotional conversation where they changed the story. This time, I needed to be clear. I wrote a message explaining that they could not move into my home. I told them I wished them well. I told them I was willing to have a respectful relationship, but I would not accept guilt, pressure, or decisions being made for me. I stared at the message before sending it. My hands were shaking, not because I was unsure, because a part of me was saying goodbye to the hope I had carried since childhood. The hope that one day my parents would finally choose me. I pressed send. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then my phone lit up. It was my father. One sentence. "We need to talk about this in person." I looked at the message. Years ago, that sentence would have scared me. This time, it didn't. Because for the first time in my life, I was not walking into that conversation as a daughter trying to be accepted. I was walking in as a woman protecting what she built. And this time, I would choose the place where the conversation happened. I chose Susan's office for the conversation because I wanted a neutral place. Not my house, not my parents' house, not a family restaurant where emotions could take over and someone could rewrite the story later. I wanted a place where everyone would have to sit with the truth. When I arrived that afternoon, Susan had already prepared coffee and arranged 4 chairs around a small conference table. There were no dramatic decorations, no audience, no family members waiting outside, just 4 people and everything that had been left unsaid for 12 years. My parents arrived first. My father wore the same serious expression he always had when he believed he was about to teach someone a lesson. My mother looked emotional. Jason arrived a few minutes later. When everyone sat down, there was a brief silence. My father looked at me. "Emily, we don't understand why you are making this so complicated." I almost smiled, because that was always how my family described my feelings. Complicated, dramatic. Too much, but I had spent years making myself smaller to make everyone else comfortable. I was done doing that. I don't think this is complicated, I said. I think it is just uncomfortable. My mother sighed. We came here because we want to fix things. I nodded. Then let's start with the truth. I placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of old messages, dates, and recent conversations. My father looked confused. What is this? The timeline. He frowned. What timeline? The timeline of what happened. I opened the folder. I showed them the messages from when I was 18. The conversation where they told me to leave. The messages where I asked if I could come back after finding another place. The silence that followed. My mother looked away. My father crossed his arms. Emily, we have already apologized for that. I looked at him. No, you explained it. That is different. The room became quiet. Because it was true. They had spent years explaining why they did what they did, but they had never really acknowledged what it did to me. I continued. You called it tough love. You called it a lesson. But from my side, it was the moment I realized I could not depend on you. Jason shifted in his chair. I think everyone made mistakes. I looked at him. Yes, they did. But mistakes only become lessons when people admit them. My father looked frustrated. So what? You want us to spend the rest of our lives apologizing? No. I shook my head. I want you to understand that I am not the same person you left outside that house. My mother wiped her eyes. We always knew you would be successful. That sentence surprised me, because I knew it was not true. You didn't know that, I said softly. You thought I would come back. Nobody answered. Because they knew. They expected me to fail. They expected me to return and accept whatever role they gave me. They never imagined I would build a life where I no longer needed their permission. I looked at my father. You told me leaving would teach me responsibility. He nodded slightly. Yes. I took a breath. It did, but it also taught me something else. I paused. It taught me that I can survive without people who only love me when I am useful. My mother started crying. Jason looked uncomfortable. My father became quiet. For the first time, he had nothing to say. I continued. I am not here to punish you. I am not here because I hate you. I am here because I finally respect myself enough to stop accepting the same treatment. My father looked down. So you are just abandoning us? That question would have destroyed me years earlier, but not anymore, I answered calmly. No, I am refusing to abandon myself again. Nobody spoke. That was the moment everything changed, because I was not begging them to understand anymore. I was telling them what I had decided. I explained that I could help them find other options. I could help them look at affordable housing. I could help them organize their finances. But they would not move into my home. My home was not a reward for finally needing me. It was the result of everything I survived without them. My mother whispered, I never realized you felt this way. I looked at her. That is the problem, Mom. You never asked. The meeting lasted almost 2 hours. There were tears. There were uncomfortable silences. There were moments where my parents tried to defend themselves. But there was also something I had never experienced before. They listened. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. When I walked out of Susan's office, I expected to feel sadness. Instead, I felt something else. Relief. For the first time since I was 18, I was no longer carrying the responsibility of making my parents happy, and that freedom changed everything. In the months that followed, my family slowly had to accept the reality they had avoided for years. I was not the daughter who would always fix things. I was not the emergency plan. I was not the person they could ignore until they needed something. The story spread through the family. Some relatives apologized. My aunt called me and admitted she had believed my parents' version because she never asked for mine. I should have known there was more to the story, she told me. I appreciated her honesty. But I also understood something. An apology does not erase years of silence. It only opens the door to doing better. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some relatives avoided the conversation completely. Because accepting my truth meant admitting they had accepted an unfair story about me. My parents also had to make difficult decisions. Without my house as an option, They downsized. They sold things they no longer needed. They adjusted their retirement plans. It was not easy, but it was their responsibility. And that was the part I had to learn. Their problems were not automatically my responsibility, just because we shared the same last name. Jason changed too. For the first time, he had to deal with family problems without assuming I would handle them. That was difficult for him. But sometimes people only grow when the person who always saves them finally stops doing it. I continued building my company. I expanded Carter Design and Renovations. I hired more employees. I started mentoring young women who were trying to rebuild their lives after difficult situations. And something unexpected happened. The more I helped others, the less anger I felt toward my past. Because I realized my story was no longer about what my parents did to me. It was about what I chose to do after. Several months later, my phone rang again. It was my mother. For a moment, I wondered if another request was coming. Another problem. Another need. But when I answered, her voice sounded different. "Emily," she said quietly, "can we talk?" I sat in silence. Because I knew this conversation would decide what kind of relationship we would have moving forward. Not the relationship we had before. That one was gone. But maybe something new. Something built on honesty.